A scream tore through the silent house. "She slipped and fell. It was an accident," my son Daniel shouted, his voice trembling. When everyone rushed in, I was lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs. The smell of wood, iron, and blood mingled in the air. I couldn't speak, but in my coat pocket, the small voice recorder had been running for 2 minutes. The last sounds I heard before everything faded into darkness were heavy footsteps, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and a faint voice, almost a plea. "Don't make me do this, Mom." He thought I'd lost my mind, but I recorded everything. My name is Helen Moore. I am 67 years old. After my husband passed away, I lived alone in a small suburban house. I spent my entire life as a nurse, caring for patients, for my family, for everyone, except myself. Now, in my children's eyes, I'm just a troublesome old woman, slow, forgetful, and irrelevant. But they've forgotten one thing. I may be old, but I'm no longer silent. If you also believe that the truth deserves to be heard, hit follow. Here, we tell real-life stories of pain, of courage, and sometimes of secrets that leave you speechless. The bravest thing you can do is to speak up. Part 2. I woke up to a pain that split through my chest. The white glare of the hospital room stung my eyes, and at first every sound seemed to echo from far away. The clatter of gurneys, the click of nurse shoes, and a familiar voice. "Doctor, please. My mother's still in pain. She fell down the stairs. Could you check her skull again?" Daniel. I forced my eyes open. My vision was still blurred, but I could make out his tall figure leaning close to the bed, hands gripping the rail as if he could barely hold himself together. We kept telling her not to go upstairs anymore, but she's so stubborn. Daniel turned to the nurse, his voice low and sorrowful. "She's been living alone for years. Her memory isn't what it used to be." I wanted to speak, to protest, but my throat felt stuffed with cotton. No sound came out. I lay there in silence, listening as Daniel painted a portrait of a senile old mother, while I, too weak to argue, almost started believing it myself. Had I really fallen? Through the haze, I recalled the evening before the fall. A simple dinner, mashed potatoes, roast beef, and a bowl of salad, was prepared for Daniel and his wife, Rachel. The house, once warm, had grown tense whenever they came by. Rachel didn't like the way I looked at her, didn't like my advice, didn't even like my presence in what used to be my own home before they moved in. That night, I said something I thought was harmless. "Rachel, honey, I know times are tough lately. If you two ever need help, I still have some savings." Daniel was pouring water then. His hand froze for a second. Rachel gave a cold smile. "You don't have to worry, Mom. We're not short on money." The air froze. Daniel looked at me, not with the eyes of a son who once cried over a broken toy, but of a man afraid of something being exposed. "Mom, you shouldn't bring up money with my wife," he said quietly but firmly. "Are you hiding something from her?" I asked. That question pushed everything past the point of no return. Rachel stood up and left the table. Daniel watched her go, then turned back to me. "I told you to stay out of it." That voice still echoes in me today, not loud, not violent, but cold as steel, and behind it was something unfamiliar. I once thought I knew my son. Daniel had been a timid boy, clingy, afraid of thunder. When my husband died, he was only 14. I became both mother and father, nurse and anchor. Maybe that's why I always found excuses for him, for the harsh words, the shouting fits, the months he spent my money and claimed it was lost. I trusted him, got disappointed, and trusted again. Now that gnawing doubt tore at me from within. It felt like two people lived inside me. One, a mother desperate to protect her child. The other, a woman shattered by the realization that her son might have pushed her down the stairs. I looked down at my hand. My right arm was scraped raw, a long claw mark streaked across the elbow. Nothing like a simple fall. I took a deep breath. The pain in my ribs made it almost impossible. I touched my left side, sharp, stabbing, burning. No, I didn't fall on my own. My body doesn't lie. And I remembered. Just before I fell, I heard, "Don't make me do this, Mom." That voice, close to my ear, cold and trembling, not a threat but a warning, a final whisper before trust was shattered, and I went down with it. 3 days after being discharged from the hospital, I returned to the old house, the one I once shared with my husband and later with my son and daughter-in-law. But now, every stair, every doorway seemed to hold a silent, watching eye. Daniel still showed up every day, bringing food, asking about my health, playing the role of the devoted son, but I began to notice how each of his words carried intention, each one steering me toward believing I was losing my mind. "When you fell, you were talking to yourself in the kitchen," he said while slicing fruit. "The doctor said your memory's been getting worse lately, remember?" I smiled, said nothing. I couldn't let Daniel know I was remembering everything. That night, sitting alone in my room, I opened my phone. Before the fall, I remembered pressing the small recorder button and slipping it into my coat pocket. I searched every recording app. Nothing. Daniel must have deleted it. My chest tightened, but then a spark of realization, cloud backup. I logged into my Google Drive. After a few seconds of searching, there it was, an audio file time-stamped exactly 6:42 p.m. on the day of my fall. I didn't dare play it. Just seeing that file still existed made my hands tremble. For the first time, not out of fear, but out of hope. Quietly, I plugged in a USB drive, downloaded the file, and hid it inside an old envelope. I tore a Christmas card in half, slid the USB inside, sealed it, and tucked it into the bottom drawer of my closet, a place untouched since 2018. The next day, I called Janine, a longtime friend who'd been a homicide detective before retiring. She arrived with 2 cups of coffee and the same sharp eyes she'd always had. I told her everything, every detail. When I mentioned the recording, her eyes lit up. "Helen, don't trust anyone. Not the police, not your neighbors, not even family. The only thing you need right now is evidence. Record everything, every word, every time, every look, all of it." From that day on, I started keeping a detailed journal. I drew a diagram of the staircase, including the spot where I stood, Daniel's position, the spacing of each step, and the height of the railing. I documented every sentence Daniel said after the accident, every comment from the nurse and doctor. I even set alarms to remind myself to write things down the moment anything unusual happened. I was no longer the fragile mother. I was a survivor rebuilding the truth. Then one night, while Daniel was out, I crept to the security router box in the electrical cabinet. The home camera system had been installed by Daniel, linked to the desktop computer in his office. He'd forbidden me from touching that computer. But Daniel forgot one thing. No mother ever forgets her child's birthday. I logged in and opened the security software. The footage was stored automatically for 7 days. That night was day 6. I reviewed the timeline up to 6:40 p.m. The hallway camera upstairs had captured everything. Me and Daniel standing by the staircase. There was no sound, but the movements were precise. I saw myself talking, one hand raised slightly as if making a point. Daniel stood close, head tilted, expression tense. Then he took one step closer. I recoiled instinctively. There wasn't a visible shove, but the way I flinched, startled, and slipped backward down the stairs, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't an accident. It was a moment of being cornered to the edge. Watching my own body tumble down those wooden steps made my heart clench, not from pain, but from recognition. That was me. Daniel stood there for a second. Then he ran after me, screaming. I saved the video, one copy on the computer, one on an external hard drive. I labeled both with a note. If anything happens to me, open this. For the first time in weeks, I could finally breathe. I was no longer the only witness. Now the truth had form, had voice, and had me standing behind it. 3 days after I recovered the video, Daniel and Rachel came to visit carrying a bag of fruit and 2 strained smiles. "We need to talk," Rachel said before even setting the bag down. I nodded and gestured for them to sit. But this time, I didn't pour tea. I wanted my hands free for whatever might happen next. "We've all said things we shouldn't have," Rachel began, softly, sitting close to Daniel, her tone calm, almost motherly. "Families have misunderstandings sometimes. You're getting older and your memory isn't what it used to be. If you hold on to every little thing, you'll only hurt yourself." I lifted my gaze to her, steady, cold as steel. "Forget," I said clearly, each word deliberate. "The staircase still smells of my blood. For nights, I've heard the sound of wood hitting my ribs every time I close my eyes." Rachel's brow furrowed slightly. Daniel sighed. "Here we go again," he muttered, his voice dropping. "You always have to play the victim, Mom." I didn't look away from my son, the boy who once cried over bad grades, who clung to my legs, begging forgiveness for breaking his father's only vase. "I don't need anyone to believe me," I said. "I just need someone to hear your voice from that night." Daniel slammed the table and stood up. The chair screeched across the floor. Rachel grabbed his arm, trying to stop things from exploding. "We're not here to argue," she whispered. "We're here to make peace. You don't really want to call the police or take this to court, do you?" They left after half an hour. No apologies, no hugs, just words wrapped in civility but edged with knives. That night, I found a note slipped under my front door. No name, no signature, written in ink. "Old women shouldn't play with fire. One day you won't wake up." I stood there for a long time watching the paper tremble in my hand, not from fear, but because I knew they were panicking, and the one about to lose control wasn't me. 2 days later, I found the back door unlocked. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, but the Christmas card box where I'd hidden the USB had been moved. I checked. The USB was still there, but someone knew where to look. I changed my plan, made another backup, sent it to Janine's email with the subject line, "Open only if I disappear." Rumors began to spread through the neighborhood. My next-door neighbor stopped by and said, "Rachel mentioned you've been a little confused lately, talking to yourself sometimes." I smiled and nodded. "Old age, dear." I didn't argue. People always trust the young, the ones who speak smoothly, over an older woman recovering from a fall. That night, I sat before my computer, finger hovering over the delete key. I opened the audio file. For the first time, I listened to the full recording. Footsteps, heavy breathing, and then, clearly, Daniel's voice. "Mom, you have to stop. Don't make me do this." It wasn't the voice of a cold-blooded killer. It was the voice of a child raised on forgiveness, fed by the belief that no matter what he did, his mother would always forgive him. I almost pressed delete. Part of me still longed to hold on to the boy I once cradled in my arms, but Janine's words echoed in my head. "If anyone's going to doubt you, Helen, just make sure it isn't you." I lifted my hand from the keyboard. I longer sought forgiveness. I no longer needed to prove I was right. All I wanted was to reclaim control of the truth, and if necessary, I would make the whole world hear it. That morning, I put on a white round collar shirt, the kind I used to wear when I was head nurse. The face in the mirror had more wrinkles now, the eyes deeper, but I saw my old self again. Not the mother who fell, but the woman standing up for the truth. I went to the local police station with Janine carrying a folder. Inside were the audio recording, the video footage from the security camera, handwritten notes, and a complete journal of times and dates. Everything was printed and organized, like a report on my own life. The young officer across from me looked detached, as if he'd heard hundreds of "mother accuses son" stories from lonely old women. "Are you sure about this? It could have been an accident. You're of an age where memory can be unreliable." Janine sat beside me silent. I took a USB from my coat pocket and handed it to him. "Please, just listen. One clip." He sighed, plugged it in. The sound filled the small meeting room. "Mom, you have to stop. Don't make me do this." For a moment, silence. No typing, no rustling papers, only the faint sound of breathing and the officer blinking slowly. "I want to press charges," I said, my voice calm, almost cold, not out of hatred, but for justice. The case was brought to civil court under the charge of intentional physical harm to an elderly family member. Rachel refused to give an official statement. Daniel hired a private lawyer, expensive, well-known, and walked into the courtroom looking composed and confident. I didn't look at him. I looked straight ahead, at the witness stand, the judge, and the doubtful faces in the crowd. I told everything, every detail, without tears, without trembling, without anger. "I'm not here to shame my son. I don't want to see him in prison. I just don't want people to think I'm a senile old woman who tripped over her own feet and imagined the rest." Then I turned to Daniel. "I don't need revenge. I need the truth." Daniel's lawyer argued that the audio didn't prove a push, that the video showed no clear physical act, but it was the silence after Daniel's recorded words and his visible panic when he realized the evidence existed that made the entire courtroom fall still. The verdict came after a week of deliberation. Daniel was sentenced to 18 months of suspended prison time, community service, and a restraining order prohibiting contact with me for at least 3 years. Rachel, the woman who laughed when I fell, who spread rumors that I was losing my mind, never came back to the house after the first hearing. People said she moved in with her sister in another state. I felt no joy, no sense of victory. I simply walked out of the courthouse standing on the old stone steps, letting the wind pass through my gray hair. Janine took my hand. We didn't need words. Someone later asked me, "Do you feel satisfied seeing your son convicted?" I just shook my head. At least I still have myself. A year after the trial, I left the city. No goodbyes, no farewell dinner, no notice to the neighbors. I simply locked the door of the house that had once been my home, the place where I built love, shed blood, and stood between life and death, and walked away. I chose a small lakeside town a few hours' drive away, a place where no one knew my name, where no one looked at me with pity or curiosity, a place with clean air, the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore, and dirt roads shaded by tall pines. I rented a small wooden house on a hillside with an old staircase leading to the attic. At first, I feared every step I took on those creaking stairs, but I learned to breathe deeply, to rest my hand on the railing, and to keep climbing. No one could hurt me here anymore. I began volunteering at the local women's center, a shelter for those who had survived domestic violence. I didn't tell my story. I just listened. Listened to the choked sobs of a 22-year-old girl pushed down her porch steps for talking too much. Listened to the trembling voice of a mother of 2, so emotionally broken by her husband's control that she had forgotten her own name. I wasn't a counselor. I had no degree in psychology, but I carried the empathy of someone who had survived. One of my new friends was Leah, a primary school teacher who lost her job after reporting that her ex-husband had secretly installed cameras in their home. No one believed her. Her family turned away. But I did, because I knew that feeling. We cooked together, read together, and sometimes just sat in silence when the past crept back too suddenly. I didn't try to erase the scars. I learned to live with them. One early autumn day, I received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was Daniel's. I recognized it instantly, though it trembled more than before. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the kitchen table beside the teapot, then took my usual walk around the lake. That evening, I opened it. "Mom, I won't justify what happened. I was wrong. Not just for that day, but for all the years I took your trust for granted and caused you harm. They ask me to write a letter to show remorse. However, I'm not writing because the court has instructed me to do so. I'm writing because I miss you. I'm writing because, for the first time in my life, I can't lie to myself. If you never reply, I'll understand. I folded the letter. No tears, no anger, just silence. I didn't write back. Forgiveness isn't a gift I owe anyone. It's a gift I'll give myself when I'm ready. The next morning, I stood by the wooden staircase in my house. The wind slipped through the curtains, carrying the scent of pine and lake water. I placed my hand on the railing and smiled. They said I fell, but I stood back up. And now, I tell the story. Sometimes what hurts us most isn't the fall, it's the silence that follows. Listen to the elderly with respect. They are not just memories. They are lives that once stood firm, loved deeply, endured quietly. And sometimes they are the bravest ones in the family.